Well, our topic for the new rotation for the Sunday school is the topic of communion. During the season of Lent, the boys and girls, and to some degree the adults in Sunday school, and certainly the adult Sunday school class, will be sharing this prevailing theme, the theme of coming to understand our communion. Now, we sometimes call communion the Lord's Supper. An original name for it is Eucharist. That's actually a Greek word that means thanksgiving, but when people say Eucharist, whether it's in the older churches or in the contemporary ones, if you hear that word, it's a reference to the communion, the Last Supper. And of course, all Christians observe this in some way to some degree. Sometimes it's with different emphasis and with some different shades of meaning, but all Christian bodies celebrate the Lord's Supper in some way and to some degree. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church also refers to this. When they say Mass, they're referring to communion as the highlight of their weekly Sunday worship. Which brings us to another thing in terms of putting communion in perspective. And that is that a lot of churches, especially the organized Old World churches, the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches, make the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the communion, the Mass, the highlight, the central focus of what they do every weekend, every Sunday when they worship. It's the highlight of their worship time. Even if they do those other things, such as reading the Scriptures, meditation, sermonette, for the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, communion is the central event of their weekly worship. That's also true for a couple of Protestant groups. The Anglican, that's the Church of England, and the Episcopal Church, the American version of that, and also the Lutheran churches are among those Protestant churches that also make sure that they have communion as a part of their weekly worship. So that's a little bit of perspective. Now, there are some churches denominations we might say, that observe communion just occasionally. And in some ways it's connected to their understanding of the meaning. For some of the denominations, especially those of the Mennonite or Baptist, or in the Old World they referred to them as Anabaptist groups, the communion is seen as a memorial. And so its emphasis and its significance and mystery is not regarded as highly as it is in the Old World churches. And so they'll celebrate it less formally and less frequently. Now, the United Methodist Church comes from the Wesleyan tradition, and John Wesley was Anglican. So he held a fairly high view of communion by Protestant standards. He would, if he could, have communion as often as possible, even more often than weekly. And he saw the taking of it as a privilege to live up to. Sometimes we've, in the United Methodist and our mother churches, if you will, the Methodist and the Evangelical United Brethren churches, had something of a rhythm of having communion quarterly, but that wasn't because we didn't want to do it. It was because in the pioneer days, the only people who were considered eligible to bless and serve the communion elements were clergy, and there was a shortage of clergy in the pioneer days in America, and so they tried to make sure that the clergy could come around to share communion at least once every 3 months. And that rhythm became kind of an accepted tradition. But the intention of John Wesley would have been to have it just as often as possible. What contemporary United Methodist churches tend to do is to have it at least quarterly, and a lot will go for weekly, as per the Anglican ideal, and some will do it in between. Now, what we do here at Mount Hope, as per present pastor's perspective, is I don't do it on the first Sunday or the second Sunday or the X Sunday of every month, but I try to do it at the same number of times per year as if we were doing it monthly, but to put an emphasis not so much on the wall calendar as the church calendar, so that we'll lift up communion in our weekly worship when there's a special rhythm to the church year, like the first Sunday in Advent, the first Sunday in Lent, of course Thursday of Holy Week, the first Sunday after Easter, the first Sunday after Pentecost, and special occasions in our life year, like getting ready for the school year, getting ready for the program year. Highlights in the rhythm of our life. It comes out to about 12 anyway, but rather than the wall calendar, we let the church calendar and the rhythm of our life dictate when those roughly 12 events come. So that's something we would already bring to the table in terms of our personal experience and how it compares to other churches and what they do about communion. Now, what we want to do is set a Bible background, a historical Bible background for communion, what its roots of meaning were for Jesus and the 12 disciples. To do that, we have to go well before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, to the Old Testament, to the roots of the meaning of the Jewish people in their life. The roots of communion are Passover. Passover was the first great festival of Jewish people. If you go back to the big picture of the Old Testament, you remember that the Old Testament was the story of a nation. We see the stories of dozens of individual heroes and the stories in their individual lives. But the big picture of the Old Testament is grasped as a single story, and the main character is not an individual hero, it's the people Israel, the covenant people Israel, and their interaction with God. Those are the two main characters of the abiding, continuing story of the Old Testament. It spans about 2,000 years from Abraham to the end of the Old Testament story, when Jews get to go back to Jerusalem from their time of exile. So Passover was the first great festival of the Jewish people. And it was always the most highly honored festival of the Jewish people. It marked the time that Jews, descendants of Abraham, the people of the covenant of Abraham, became people with a name, with dignity, and with the status of being a people distinct among the nations. And while that promise started with Abraham, it really took hold in terms of their dignity and their heritage when, under Moses' leadership, they were freed from slavery in Egypt. That was when they gained their covenant dignity as a people and began their journey. And just to briefly visit that, the descendants of Abraham went to Egypt at a time of famine, when Abraham's great-grandson Joseph rose to leadership in Egypt after having been a slave there, and was called to deliver the Egyptians and the peoples of the surrounding nations of the world from a long drought, a long time of famine. And so the Jews migrated from Canaan to Egypt and settled there. Some generations later, they ended up as slaves with no dignity or citizens' rights, and God raised up Moses to set them free. The night that the Jews were freed from slavery in Egypt was the night of the last of the 10 plagues, the death plague. And the Jews were told to mark their doorpost with the blood of a lamb. If they marked their doorposts with that blood, then the angel of death that moved across the Egyptian land would pass over the people of the covenant who were so marked with that blood on their doorpost. And that's where the name Passover comes, when the death plague passed over the Jewish people on its way to plaguing all the others around them. And that was the night of their freedom. They were told to be ready for that night, to have their things packed. They were able to bring some things from their Egyptian neighbors as a sort of a booty that they asked from their neighbors. And they were to eat their last meal in a solemn holiness and in haste. There were very specific instructions for the Jews. They were to make a meal that could be made quickly, consumed quickly, so that they could leave and go directly into their freedom. They were to eat roast lamb, not to be fixed in any complicated way, but slaughtered and roasted and eaten. In fact, there are descriptions in Exodus, and the main description is in Exodus 12. They were to fix that lamb, to cook that lamb by roasting, because it was the quickest way to do it, to stand and eat their meal in haste. They could eat it with bread, but the bread was to be made in haste, which meant they did not have time to let it rise and to bake, to go through that more complicated process. They simply made the bread and cooked it quickly without yeast. And they could eat this entire meal in haste and be on their way. So, Passover becomes the identity of the Jewish people for all the generations that followed. And they always remembered it with a meal of lamb, highlighted with bread that was unleavened, that could be cooked in haste and eaten in haste. There were three great festivals of the Jews throughout the centuries that followed Moses, right up through the time of Jesus. There was Passover, there was the Harvest Feast of Weeks, that was at the end of the spring growing season. That's also more recently known as Pentecost. And then there is the Fall Festival, the Feast of Booths, when they remembered what it was like to have to camp out for a living. And Jews all over the world, even today, in the fall will celebrate the Feast of Booths by doing the closest thing they can do to camping out. In New York City, they'll sleep on the fire escape balconies sometimes, just to remember what it's like not to have a home. And during that time, of course, is also the time of the Jewish New Year and the Day of Purification, the Day of Atonement. All those things tie together. So they have those three feasts: early spring, late spring, and fall. But the most important of them always was Passover. That's when they came to know who they were as God's people and were given freedom and dignity. And all Jews were to remember, as if they themselves had planted their feet in the Egyptian soil. When those people went out, I was one of them, even though literally they weren't. They wanted the Jewish people to understand that's where the source of their identity and dignity came. So Passover is really the model and the source for Jesus' practice of the communion, which we'll get to very soon. Every Jew, when they could do it, aspired to have at least one Passover in their life in Jerusalem. There's a slogan that said, "Next year in Jerusalem." At least one Passover in their life would be held there if they had the means to do it. Now, of course, by New Testament times, there were Jews scattered all over the Roman Empire, and a lot of them would never be able to afford the travel to be there. But they would dream of it, they'd hope for it, they'd help their relatives get there, they'd get there themselves if they could. If they couldn't, and they could make it at another time, they would do that. But Passover stood as the central experience of the Jewish person. Now, Jews today, of course, celebrate Passover as well. Over the centuries, the meal has become a little bit more elaborate with some symbolic meaning built into what's more recently called the Seder meal. It's a little more complex, it has more components to it, and each of them has an assigned meaning. The different things that they eat. For instance, they'll have bitter herbs as part of the meal to remind them of the hardship and suffering they had. There's a little cup of salt water there where you can dip bitter herbs in it. The salt water reminds them of the tears that were shed during that time of suffering. There's a little sweet vegetable and fruit mix called hariceth, and it represents the mortar that was used to build the bricks while they were slaves. The Seder meal is more complicated. It's not unmanageably complicated, but it's more complex than the basic Passover meal as described in Exodus. Those other components have come with traditions over the centuries. The two things we know the most about are the unleavened bread, which was to be continued to be used for several days after the initial Passover feast, and also the roasted lamb. Of course, during that meal there is also the cup of thanksgiving, which was a wine cup. And so those components of the Passover meal had a continued and abiding meaning as Passover continued to be given to each new generation of Jews. What that means is that Jesus and his disciples, who did all their ministry within the boundaries of the Jewish people, and effectively in Jesus' day, that was Galilee around the city of Jerusalem, where there was a rebuilt temple after the Old Testament, or at the end of the Old Testament days. And then there was Galilee, a district like about the size of a county today in the north, where Jesus grew up and where the center of his ministry was. So Jesus and his disciples, and nearly all the people with whom they ministered during the years of his ministry, were Jews. And they, of course, would aspire to be there too. We know that Jesus visited Jerusalem during several times in his life. The most famous ones are when he was brought by his parents to be dedicated soon after his birth. Another time, a famous story in Luke's Gospel, is when Jesus was about 12 and he was taken to Jerusalem. Oftentimes when a young boy would come of age, which was around 12, they'd try to make sure that was a chance for them to get to Jerusalem if possible. And we know from John's Gospel that there are vivid descriptions of several visits Jesus made to Jerusalem during his ministry. Not all of them at Passover, but some of them. And certainly the climactic visit of Jesus with his disciples at Jerusalem was in the Passover holiday in Jerusalem just prior to his crucifixion. That's the visit in which the communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the Mass, whatever different Christian groups have referred to it by name, that was when it was initiated. It was during the Passover in Jerusalem and the week that Jesus was crucified and later rose. So it's against that background that we visit and learn about the origin of communion. During those last few days of his ministry on earth, Jesus, with his disciples, intended, like everybody else in the city, to observe the communion, the Passover feast, together. More than one of the Gospels tells us about the disciples saying, well, where will we have our Passover feast? And more than one of the Gospels tells us about Jesus saying to a delegation of disciples, you go out and follow this man, and he will lead you to the place where a room is furnished, and there we'll gather and we'll have our Passover feast. They seemed to be low-key about it. Of course, there was some tension about Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, so they didn't make it a big public affair, but they gathered in that room to observe their Passover as a group together. That's where Jesus initiated what we now call communion. When Jesus was there with his disciples, he gave special attention to two of the components that we've mentioned. Incidentally, the earliest written accounts of that first communion are probably found either in Mark 14 or 1 Corinthians 11. We don't know which one was first. We believe that Mark was the first of the four Gospels to actually be written, then Matthew, then Luke, and then John. But while Mark was writing his Gospel, Paul was doing his missionary journeys. And as closely as they can tell, the Gospel of Mark was written roughly about the same time that the Apostle Paul was writing to the Corinthians and describing the First Communion for them. So we don't know which of those was first, but it's an interesting footnote to know that one of them almost certainly was. And they're pretty consistent in terms of what they describe. I think Luke mentions the cup before the bread, but aside from that, they're pretty consistent. John describes that night vividly, but he doesn't specify communion. Maybe he knew about the other Gospels and thought he didn't have to. John tells us a lot more about the washing of the feet and the prayers of Jesus for his disciples in the world. He tells us things that the other three Gospels didn't tell us. So if you want a description, a vivid description of that very first communion and that Passover night when Jesus introduced it, you can start with Mark 14, 1 Corinthians 11, or the accounts in Matthew and Luke as well. When Jesus gathered, he understood some things that the other disciples could not fully understand yet. He knew the context of his ministry and what its meaning was going to become. He knew that his earthly ministry was coming to an end. And he knew that the world would never be the same after his death and resurrection. And so, during that meal, that Passover meal, when they all remembered that they once were slaves in Egypt, and that they were all saved by the blood of that lamb that was painted over the doorpost of the folks who were saved from death. Jesus gathered with his disciples, and it says he took a loaf of bread. We'll give you a footnote here for folks who may have an interest in this, because sometimes Christians will say, well, what was that bread like? What should that bread be like? Are we violating communion if we do certain things? That may or may not be an issue locally, but if you're in conversation with especially Protestant Christians in other places, that concern may arise. So let me just make a comment, because sometimes we'll feel that, I've run into this occasionally, I don't know whether you have. Sometimes our Christian friends will say, well, it's not proper if you have any yeast in it, because, you know, and there's been a quote from a certain part of the New Testament suggesting that yeast is a sign of evil, of sin, so we shouldn't use it. Paul made a reference to a little leaven leavens the whole lump. However, we don't want to presume that, because Jesus also said the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, that someone will put in their bread and it becomes greater than it was at its start. This may not be a concern, but just in case it comes up anywhere, we don't need to worry one way or the other about that. If we do use unleavened bread or flat bread or something, that's not to avoid evil or violation of what Jesus intended. It is to make things as authentic as we could make them in terms of getting back to the setting of the original communion. If it were really, really important to worry about what kind of bread it was, one of the gospel writers at least probably would have used the Greek word for unleavened bread, azimos. Truth of the matter is, none of them did. They all used the word artos for common bread when they described the original communion. It's possible that it didn't matter to the disciples and they just used the word for bread because they knew everybody would know what it meant. It is somewhat possible that Jesus wanted to clarify that he was doing something brand new, and that therefore he would have had a loaf and used it to designate that this is a beginning of something new, and it's not only for Jews anymore. We don't know. The But I raise that issue because I've heard it as a concern in some places. It doesn't matter theologically which we use. We can do one to bring us back to the setting, to the authenticity of the original event. We can use the other to designate the newness of meaning. But God isn't worried about what kind of bread we use. God is worried about what kind of heart we have when we take it. He took that bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples and said, "You take and eat, because this is not Passover bread anymore. What I am offering you is my body." Over the centuries, Christians have said, well, what does that mean? And some denominations have been concerned about whether that meant it was Jesus' own body, and is that what happens? There's a difference there between what the Roman Catholic Church has taught, that it's really flesh and it's really blood as soon as the priest says those words. We honor and respect that with the understanding, from a Protestant point of view, that the physical transformation isn't vital. It's the spiritual presence of Jesus Christ that's vital. And after all, Jesus was very clearly distinct in his physical body at the time that he broke the bread. And so it's not that he was turning it into a pound of flesh or something. So the Protestant point of view is that Jesus was offering them his presence. But he said, "This is my body." And it's no longer to represent that first covenant, that night in Egypt, when a lamb was slaughtered. It's not the body of that lamb. This is my presence. And implicitly, by the time Jesus was done with the Passover meal and with the crucifixion and with all that went after, we understand that in analogy to that Passover lamb whose life was taken and whose blood was shed to save the Israelites in Egypt, it is Jesus' presence. He was the sacrificial lamb for the new covenant. And his presence is with those who are heart to heart knit together in him for all time. That we are one with his body when we break that bread. It's a holy, a mystical time. It says that he took the cup. Now that cup would have been taken because it was a part of the Passover meal. And he gave thanks over the cup. But again, when he offered it to the disciples, he changed its meaning for them and for everyone who would be his followers thereafter. This cup is not a cup of wine of thanksgiving. And if you ever made a connection that it would have been the blood of a lamb, reminding us of the lamb that was slaughtered for the Passover and its blood painted over the doorpost, it's not that. This is my blood. This is my life. Now, one of the consistent teachings in the early books of the Old Testament is that the blood is where the life is found. It's a theological understanding that where there is blood in an animal, in a creature, there you find its life, and you respect its life. And that's why, among other things, the Jews were told that they should not eat or drink blood, because it's the life of something, and it's something that you honor. It's not something you take into yourself as if it's just routine diet. But Jesus is putting a radical new direction on this when he says, you take and you drink this. That's a departure from the Old Testament perception. Well, that's part of what Jesus is all about. This is a new covenant. It's the beginning of a new covenant, just like that Passover night was a night when their identity and dignity was claimed, and everybody remembers that singular night. Jesus is telling his disciples, when you eat of this bread, when you drink of this cup, you are instituting and connecting afresh with a new covenant. And it's not that lamb anymore. It's my presence. And it is not an animal, a creature's blood that was on a doorpost that saved you from death long, long ago. This is my life that I am giving for you. And I want you to do something very non-Jewish. If you understand this is my life, my blood, I want you to take it into yourself so that you know that your life is infused in mine. It's a whole new understanding of what you do with blood and why. When Jesus introduced that bread and that cup, he changed everything, and Passover could never be the same for followers of Jesus Christ. In a lot of ways, in fact, Passover could never be the same. It wasn't really Passover. While it drew its original roots and meanings, especially for Jews, from Passover, it would never quite be Passover again, because the meaning of what you are taking has changed, and the liberty of taking in the lifeblood has changed. It's not something that you violate when you do it, it's something that you become sanctified when you do it. And you get to carry the privilege and responsibility of carrying your life in the life of Jesus. You're infused together with him. Clearly, no one tethered to the Old Testament could take the bread and drink the cup without understanding that their identity, even with respect to the Old Covenant, is now altered. If you take communion as Paul commanded in Corinthians, if you take communion perceiving the body and blood of Christ, then you are doing something that would be against the principles of the Old Covenant of Moses. There's already a separation even if you are of Jewish heritage. This carries forward into everything that Christianity was intended in the mind of God to become. Christianity, while it started with Jewish roots, and while the earliest efforts at evangelizing were almost exclusively Jewish, coming fresh off of a sermon about the woman at the well who was not Jewish, we know that it wasn't exclusive, but it was largely Jewish. This changes a lot of things. Christianity is not exclusively Jewish. It's not primarily Jewish. And it doesn't change the dignity or identity or the stature of any nation or any race or any ethnic group over any others. Jews need Jesus like everybody else. And the intention of the gospel is to become a worldwide movement that includes all kinds of people across the world. We would do well to remember and put the origin of communion into perspective that the New Testament book of Hebrews brings us to. From that night on, the gathering of believers to share the bread and the cup, whether they're Jews or of the nations, has a whole new meaning that even within the lifetime of the first generation of apostles would see the end of the old meaning. You could still remember that it had some Jewish ties, some Passover ties. But what the book of Hebrews shows us and what Jesus tangibly demonstrates in the introduction of that first communion is that the ways we make ourselves available to and in peace with God can never be the same as they were in the Old Covenant. Because physical sacrifice is no longer how we make peace. All the folks through the Old Testament and in the time of that second temple in Jerusalem sought their ways intermittently to make peace with God by sacrificing something on the altar. Jesus is now the ultimate sacrifice. He is the ultimate lamb not for one people at one time and place, but for all people at every time and place. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And it's no longer about being free from slavery either to Egyptians in a certain time or to our sin throughout our life. The atonement for our sin is Jesus. It's the giving of his life, his blood, that atones for all the sins of all time. Now there's an analogy and meaning that's really helpful here, because if we're living in sins, we're slaves. And when we are atoned in Jesus, we're free of that slavery. We might still err and fall on our faces from time to time to remind us that we are not yet in heaven. But the atonement, the reconciling, the peacemaking with God is no longer through something we buy or sell or put on the altar. It's by the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And that's true for all people. We're now a new covenant people. Before the last of the apostles died, the second temple, where everyone had been going, was destroyed. And it's never been rebuilt again. The first generations of Christians saw that as God's ultimate sign of saying, that door is closed. If you want to have peace with God, you take and make yourself a part of the body of Jesus, and you find your life infused in his. And that's what the bread and the cup are to remind us of, until he comes and we see him face to face again. And it's for all people. As John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world. Not one nation, not one people at one time or place. For God so loved the world. And now, in place of that Passover, all Christians have a holy meal to remind us of where we got our dignity, where we got our spiritual start. And every time we take of the bread and drink of the cup, we are one with the Son of God, who set all willing spirits free, all times, all places, forever. Thank God for this gift, and may we enjoy it to the depths of our souls as often as we can, until we feast again with him in the kingdom. Amen.